Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my great good friend Mark Laxer, and we're going to talk about something or nothing or anything, as usual.
As usual, very good to talk with you, John. So last night, I was on Twitter trying to understand. I've been using Twitter lately just to sort of see. I mean, I check the news, but it's sort of an interesting way to see what other people are thinking about the news. The same news that I'm digesting. And it's interesting to see people whom I respect and some of whom I don't respect, how they're reacting. So it's a quick way to sort of get a zeitgeist of, you know, how did the first impeachment trial day go? And you know, oh, we almost lost the Capitol. You know, how are you feeling? That's just little bits of everyday life here. So last night on Twitter, I was just sort of checking things out after the first day of Donald J. Trump's impeachment trial. And I saw an interesting tweet by somebody who's involved with something called Project Lincoln.
Yes, yeah.
Stuart Stevens is his name, and he's somebody I'd reached out to before trying to start a dialogue about the phenomenon of QAnon and this whole Republicans not seeming to follow rule of law or the United States Constitution and little minor things like that. And he never really responded to me. He's like a bigwig, famous guy, helped 4 or 5 presidents. And, you know, he's on that level. But I respect him. And if he doesn't respond to me, that's fine. I don't actually have a problem with that. I'm not sure, frankly, I would respond to me either.
Yeah, you wouldn't join any clubs that would have you as a member, eh?
I think that's fair and well said. So he put an interesting tweet out, and I just sort of noticed it had nothing to do with directly about politics. It had to do with a poet named Sylvia Plath.
Yep.
And his tweet was something about he just saying a professor of poetry had once said that one of Ted Hughes's wives, one being Sylvia Plath, had stuck her head in the oven and killed herself. And then another wife of Ted Hughes did something similar. And so rather than sort of look at Sylvia and like, what's your issue, dear? It was, I'm paraphrasing. It was sort of like, well, what is it about you, Ted, that all your wives are sticking their heads in ovens, sort of thing. And that was it. It was just all within however many characters you can find in a tweet. And I saw that and I thought, wow, how interesting, because I have a connection with Sylvia Plath in that when I was 19 years old or so, and I was at UC San Diego in college as an English American literature major, I started taking course in, it was Sylvia Plath and some other poet, I forget their name. And I started taking it and I said, oh my gosh, when we got our first assignments, how utterly depressing. And then I looked at like next week's assignment and I went to the library. I actually was working in the library at that time. And I started picking out books by Sylvia Plath and this other author. Was Ted Hughes a poet?
Ted Hughes was a poet. Tom Gunn is the same period. Seamus Heaney.
No, it might, John, it might have been Ted Hughes then. It was some other author. And I think I read both of them. It's just sort of checking this out. And I ended up dropping the class because it was just too bloody depressing for me. I thought if there's not, I set a little goal for myself that I'm going to go into the library, and if I can't find a single positive thing in any of these poems of these two authors, it's not to say that the authors weren't worth anything. It's not to diss them. It's not to cancel them. It's just, as a 19-year-old, I needed at that time in my life to have at least a little bit of hope for living. And it's just something I had a need for.
I had a very similar filtering process at that age. And to some extent, I still do. You know,
Fascinating.
It surprised me. I was about 13 and I realized that the music I listened to was having an emotional effect on me. And
Yeah.
I started to go, why is so much music depressing? Why is so much music about things that are upsetting?
Right.
And I started to deliberately, you know, read things and listen to things that would change my mood. And sometimes to be cathartic, it'd be something negative that I'd be listening to. You know, if I felt upset, I'd listen to an album called "I Can Stand a Little Rain" by Joe Cocker, because I'd sing along with it, and it would always make me cry. And afterwards, I'd feel, you know, catharsis had occurred. I'd feel better. Sylvia Plath is somebody I've never been able to get to. I really respect her poetic genius. There's no doubt about that. Black Rook in Rainy Weather is the one I remember.
Right.
But as you say, and I really, you know, you've actually touched a nerve, because this is something extraordinarily important to me. I've written since I was 13. I've written poetry. I have run a poetry channel, as you know.
Yes.
I've written novels. I've written plays. I've written all sorts of things over the years. I paint. I play music. I sing. You know, I'm a drummer. The arts and creativity are very important to me. But I found that during the bleak periods of my life, which are the periods when, you know, other people produce great art, I don't want to write. I don't want to paint, because I don't want to share. You know, I've upset enough people over my life just by being miserable in their company. I don't want to share that. And I think it's such a theme of the 20th century to make art out of misery, art out of anxiety. And I mean, answering the question about Ted Hughes, perhaps it said that 50% of writers suffer from depression, as opposed to 10% in the normal population. So there's a pre-selection. Maybe Ted Hughes just fancied women who looked mournful and sad, you know. And
well, maybe he found them deeper.
Yes. And maybe
I don't mean that in any negative way at all.
Yeah.
I really don't. I sincerely don't mean that in a negative way. Somebody who's, I mean, if you're going through life, you can just sort of look at this pretty little glitzy and let's go buy this and la 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 la. Or you could see what the challenges that we face as a species, and we're all going to die kind of thing. And maybe there's afterlife, maybe there's not. And maybe the afterlife sucks. We just actually don't know. We don't have a lot of control. Or and how's your prostate, and how's your colon, and do you have brain cancer? I'm not sure if I have brain cancer, and my back hurts, and it's like there's some really dark stuff. And meanwhile, half the people want to kill one third of the population wants to kill the other third, while the final third is watching, which seems to be not only functional in Germany in the 30s and 40s, but around the world. So there's a lot. All I'm saying is there's a lot of darkness out there, and somebody might be attuned to that and be honest about that and accept that. Other people need to filter that out to get through the day, and other people have a kind of balance to it. As a 19-year-old, to be honest with you, I guess part of my point in even mentioning all this is this. Talking with you, it's like the nuances are coming out. It's very healthy, I think, but in a little tiny tweet, it's hard to express this. So when I was 19, my dad was an artist and a photographer, but an abstract photographer, and I had to push back against some of that for, you know, and I think maybe that was part of why I needed to do that as a 19-year-old, not get into Sylvia Plath. I couldn't read Kafka and Camus. I can now, but it was too dark for me. I tried to express this, John, in a tweet, copying. I don't know. Copying is probably not a tweet term, but I retweeted, or I tweet commented, or I tweet.
Tweetified.
Thank you. I tweetified back to Stuart, and then there might have been someone else on that initial thread. I'm not sure, but it got into the public arena, and I said, and I paraphrase, something like, as a 19-year-old at UC San Diego, UCSD, just south of UCLA, same school system, I dropped out of the course on Sylvia Plath, and it might have been Ted Hughes as well. Because of this, I couldn't find anything. There was no positive light. And I said, I see this in other systems as well. Like, I can't find any light in Trumpism or fascism, and it's just too much for me. Bing. Then I hit send. Immediately, John. When I say immediately, I've been criticized that I exaggerate. So, and I do exaggerate. I told you 1,000,000 times I exaggerate.
You have. That's true, though. You have.
But within a fairly short amount of time, there was a lot of responses. There weren't millions, but people were pissed off at me. People were really knocking me. The problem is you. It's not, you couldn't find any light in Sylvia Plath. The problem is you. You must not like poetry. You must be. And it's like, wow. And at first I felt under attack, but then I thought, this is a really important educational experience for me, because first of all, it's teaching me about Twitter. It's teaching me about communication. And I wrote back to these people saying, I don't necessarily feel that way now. I'm saying, as a 19-year-old, I felt that way. I say, do you see the difference? But I wasn't trying to be nasty to these people.
Yeah.
And some of them, I mean, there's like 20 or something like that, people who liked a comment saying, you must, the problem is you. You're the problem. And that I took that, it's a little personal, because it's a personal thing I shared. And this is the whole conversation. Anyways, one person, I tried to turn it around, because here's the thing. I thought, oh boy, I really stepped in it. And it hurt. I felt hurt. And I thought, I want to try to turn this around. And I wrote, I said, gee, I was talking about how I felt as a 19-year-old. And then someone said, I said, I apologize. I didn't mean to diss this author. It wasn't about that. And one person said, oh, I know. I tied it in with a novel I'm reading called A Burning. Have you ever heard of that, John? A Burning?
No.
Oh, it's a very powerful novel. And I tied this in my comments, saying that this Sylvia Plath reminded me of this book I just read. It's called A Burning by Megha Majumdar.
Okay. Yep.
It's a very, very, very well-written novel. It is tight. It's a very powerful, and it's so dark. I couldn't find any. It was just like Sylvia Plath, and for me. And so I'm running a podcast with my dear friend Eric, who's a musician, and next on our list is to read Burning. And Eric just chatted me. I think it was 2 nights ago. Like, are we going to do this next? And I said, I don't know. It reminds me of Sylvia Plath, because I can't find anything positive in it. And this whole thing of coming up in this tweet, it made me think, because the people were saying to me in their responses, some of them were not nasty, most of them, I don't think anyone meant to be nasty to me. I think they were just saying, we value this author and you're dissing her, screw you, sort of thing. And that's fine. Or maybe not screw you, but you're something wrong with you.
There was obviously nothing wrong with her. She committed suicide.
Right. She stuck her head in the oven. That's fine. But it was obviously something wrong with me as a 19-year-old to be sort of scared about her world or nervous.
You might be led into a suicidal mindset by somebody who was suicidal. I mean, what a ridiculous idea.
Seriously. Yeah. And I have an oven. I mean, I could just go downstairs. I'll be right back. So the thing about this is it made me think there's some good that comes out of this. See, this is what I have to do in my life. I have to find the pearls. People were saying, Mark. Well, they didn't say Mark. It wasn't that personal. They'd say asshole. No, they didn't do that. They
Mr. Laxer.
No, they didn't do that. In tweet world, there's none of that formality or niceness that I can see.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure maybe it is out there. They said it's not the content, it's her use of language. It's the vibrancy of it. They said, look at the language. And that helped me because now I want to do this book for the podcast because the language is so beautiful. That's the beauty in this book. Everything else is really, really dark, really dark.
Can I make a comparison here? I'm a huge fan of the work of Rembrandt van der Rijn, the great Rembrandt. I've seen all of the self-portraits. There are 60 of them. I've traveled the world and seen his paintings all over the place. As a painter, I'm absolutely dedicated to this man and his technical skill. He has no rival. He has no rival. Nobody deals with paint the way that Rembrandt dealt with paint. So let's take a particular example of a Rembrandt. There's, which I'm sure Spike will find for us. And this is The Blinding of Samson. Now, in the painting, we see a spear being thrust into Samson's eye. And what your commentators are saying is, forget that this is making you think about having a spear shoved in your eye. Look at how beautiful the paint is. Now, I am not capable of that dissociation. For me, an author, or a painter, an artist, they give their whole message. And sometimes, Mahler's Songs for Dead Children, there's a slightly off-putting title, but it's actually a very beautiful piece of work. We look at something like Munch's The Scream, this really well-known expressionist painting. Yeah. And when you get into his background, you find out, I believe, all of his siblings died of tuberculosis prior to the painting of that picture. He is resonating something he's experiencing. And the idea that I can somehow dissociate that and say, but look at the beauty of the paint, means that I'm missing what's being said. Because what's being said is partly the beauty of the paint, partly the beauty of the language. And I can appreciate Kafka or Camus or whatever from that point of view. And I certainly appreciate Rembrandt from that point of view. But part of what's being said, if it's being said with such brilliance, will actually take you to the message. And the message is, I'm feeling suicidal. Won't somebody help me?
Yes, exactly. Thank you for that, for framing it that way, John. And I think your analogy with Rembrandt and Sam and the sword or
poke in the eye.
Yeah, in the eye, I think that's a good one because some people can go there. Other people, I mean, as a 60-year-old, I can now go there, whereas a 19-year-old I couldn't. But even now, it's I would generally choose not to, but I can also say, yes, the artistry, it's a brilliant use of language. This is Megha Majumdar really, really freaking knows how to write.
Mm.
Plus, she must have a brilliant editor. Not to, it's just the combination, or maybe she has no editor. She just wrote it.
Maybe she edits herself. Yeah.
Maybe she edits herself, and that's absolutely fine. However it is, this is a brilliantly written piece. And it's got the thing going right into the eye, and it's all mushy, and it's painful. I read this anyway. I find this stuff fascinating, and it was just fascinating to see Twitter lacking. A Twitter communication is lacking the sort of the human element. You can't really get out this, oh, well, I was my 19-year-old self, and my dad was an artist, and I was in kind of loving and respecting my dad hugely. I mean, I grew up in his darkroom watching these images show up, but I had to rebel against that. How am I going to get that out? What is it, 140 characters or 280 characters in a tweet? You can't get that kind of nuance of communication.
Well, unless you're a great poet, of course, in which case, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. There's your 140 words and less. So you see, the thing is, work up to becoming as good at poetry as William Shakespeare, and you'll be able to tweet. But yeah, short of that sort of exquisite ability to use language, the rest of us have a bit more of a problem in confining things to that.
Yes, and even in Shakespeare, I think part of the brilliance of really fine crafted, refined prose or poetry is that you can take so many meanings from it. And I think it felt like mob rule out there. I could see how miscommunication can possibly, with the help of algorithms and how the algorithms, what gets shared and what gets emphasized. Maybe Twitter is a great medium for inflammation.
Yeah, it's great at putting something underneath your skin that can fester. Yeah,
correct. And I think Mr. Zuckerberg has a similar operation going, and neither of which are particularly helpful to society.
No, I mean, we're seeing horrors. I mean, the murder of Muslims in India because of myths generated on Facebook. The use of polarization and opposition through Cambridge Analytica and aggregate IQ, the Robert and Becca Mercer's little brainchild, that it is something awful. I think there's something else that you've opened a real can of worms here, because there are so many aspects of this that I find fascinating. One of them is dictating another person's taste, and to me, for many years, I'm an art theorist. I've written aesthetic theory, believe it or not. But when I was in my 20s, when I was a lad and didn't realize that such things were wrong and ignoble, one of the first points for me is let's take it physically, let's take it biologically. In the 1950s, there was a guy who was making ice cube trays. And somebody called him up about his new tray and said, "Oh, it's got this horrible bitter taste, the ice." So he went to the freezer and he got some ice out, and he couldn't taste anything. And then a week or so later, somebody else complained, and people complained, here and there. And they did some testing to see what was going on. And what they found was that one person in 1,000, I believe it was, could taste this chemical that was being shed by the plastic. So their perception was real, but very few people actually can taste it. And that, when I first read that, and I must have been in my 20s at the time, so about 40 years ago, that blew my mind, because it said, well, we all perceive the world differently because of the equipment we're born with. We all then develop that equipment to interpret the world differently. And so when I encountered the work of Raymond Williams, who in the 1950s put forward this idea that there's no such thing as high or low culture. It's a nonsense. It's a creation of culture to say that opera is high art and that music hall is low art. That a folk song is a poor mere thing, whereas if Chopin comes and turns it into something, it's now a great work. And the reality is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's down to the development of your perception. And the person who knows what food you like best of all is you. So the person who, and we can change somebody's experience. If I really love Sylvia Plath and I wanted to do Sylvia Plath a service, then I would have come to you in a friendly way and said, how very interesting that at 19 you felt that. Have you seen this poem by Sylvia Plath?
Quick comment about that, if I might.
Yeah.
So some of the people sort of glommed on to one comment, which is, you're the problem.
Yeah. And you are the problem, Mark. Let's face it.
I think you and Spike and Steve and our circle of friends have been aware of that for some time.
We tolerate you. What can I say?
It's been. I try to wear the hat to hide, but
yeah,
it doesn't always work.
Yeah, because you don't have a point.
Just yes. What is
that? Yeah.
What is the point?
Yeah.
So, but others, I say others, there weren't that many. Although if I check now, I mean, for all I know, there's a war out there going on.
Yeah.
Because of me. But let's just leave that for now. So one of the comments was, well, it was interesting. I responded and thought to the to the comment saying, it's the language, the Rembrandt mastery, and not the. I responded to that comment, that tweet, and said, wow, thank you so much for pushing back. I will now approach, this, and incidentally, ironically, this story in part is based on someone making a Facebook comment and ends up in prison and horrible things happen. So, anyway, it's a little bit like the tail being eaten by the snake. But I wrote that, gosh, thank you for mentioning, I'm going to approach a burning with this new understanding. And I would like to, as not a 19-year-old, go back and explore Sylvia Plath poems. And then somebody, who liked that? You can like someone's tweet. This famous guy, Stuart Stevens, the guy who, going back to the top honcho, because it's such a hierarchical planet we live in, he's the big guy. He was his comment is his tweet is what I commented on initially. So he saw what I saw. He saw this little mini tweet storm or whatever you call it, very small. And he liked what I wrote. And then someone saw that and said, why don't you read this poem by this poem? It's called The Tulip. And there's another one by Sylvia Plath. And I did. So this morning I was reading Sylvia Plath poems.
Is The Tulip short enough for us to include in this broadcast, do you think?
I think it is.
Do you have a copy there?
If you're not upset that I'm logging on to, and here's Twitter. And let's see what nasty comments I have here. Irem and two others like to reply to your tweet. Actually, you said you couldn't, but that's fine. It's not for everyone. But to drop a class over it as if it wasn't worth your time just sounded really dismissive. Her legacy isn't really about the oven, but about the words.
Okay.
Someone else said, this is an amazing dialogue, y'all. Too bad it's not something more people are interested in engaging in these days.
And it's happening on Twitter.
Yes, exactly. The person who sent me the poem I wrote, what a powerful poem. I could go there with her. I'm 6 years old now. I imagine my 19-year-old self at college being unsure and perhaps frightened of her world. And then I'm going to try to find the poem. Yes, Tulips. Is Tulips? Should I
Tulips.
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 I would recommend a look at the great poem Tulips.
Let's hear it. Let's hear it. Read it to us, Mark.
All right, this is from the Tulips from the Poetry Foundation. That's this nice person sent me a link on Twitter. Tulips by Sylvia Plath. The tulips are too excitable. It is winter here. Look how white everything is. How quiet, how snowed in. I am learning peacefulness, lying by myself quietly as the light lies on these white walls, this bed, these hands. I am nobody. I have nothing to do with explosions. I have given my name and my day clothes up to the nurses, and my history to the anesthetist, and my body to surgeons. They have propped my head between the pillow and the sheet cuff, like an eye between two white lids that will not shut. Stupid pupil, it has to take everything in. The nurses pass and pass. They are no trouble. They pass the way gulls pass inland in their white caps, doing things with their hands, one just the same as another, so it is impossible to tell how many there are. My body is a pebble to them. They tend it as water tends to the pebbles it must run over, smoothing them gently. They bring me numbness in their bright needles. They bring me asleep. Now I have lost myself. I am sick of baggage. My patent leather overnight case like a black pillbox. My husband and child smiling out of the family photo. Their smiles catch into my skin, little smiling hooks. I have let things slip. A 30-year-old cargo boat stubbornly hanging onto my name and address. They have swabbed me clear of my loving associations, scarred and bare on the green plastic pillow trolley. I watched my tea set, my bureaus of linen, my books sink out of sight, and the water went over my head. I'm a nun now. I've never been so pure. I didn't want any flowers. I only wanted to lie with my hands turned up and be utterly empty. How free it is. You have no idea how free. The peacefulness is so big, it dazes you. And it asks nothing, a name tag, a few trinkets. It is what the dead close on. Finally, I imagine them shutting their mouths on it like a communion tablet. The tulips are too red in the first place. They hurt me. Even through the gift paper, I could hear them breathe lightly through their white swaddlings like an awful baby. Their redness talks to my wound. It corresponds. They are subtle. They seem to float, though they weigh me down, upsetting me with their sudden tongues and their color. A dozen red lead sinkers round my neck. Nobody watched me before. Now I'm watched. The tulips turn to me and the window behind me. Where once a day the light slowly widens and slowly thins, and I see myself flat, ridiculous, a cut paper shadow between the eye of the sun and the eyes of the tulips. And I have no face. I have wanted to efface myself. The vivid tulips eat my oxygen. Before they came, the air was calm enough, coming and going, breath by breath, without any fuss. Then the tulips filled it like a loud noise. Now the air snags and eddies round them, the way a river snags and eddies round a sunken rust-red engine. They concentrate my attention that was happy, playing and resting without committing itself. The walls also seem to be warming themselves. The tulips should be behind bars like dangerous animals. They are opening like the mouth of some great African cat. And I'm aware of my heart. It opens and closes. Its bowl of red blooms out of sheer love of me. The water I taste is warm and salt like the sea, and comes from a country far away as health.
Mm.
Tulips by Sylvia Plath.
Beautifully read. Yeah, how fascinating, because isn't that Samson having his eye poked out? This is a profound expression of despair, of dissociation, of we even got a quick mention of Ted Hughes there in a photograph with their child, which is one of the other things that bothers me, when I know of people, having children myself and having been put under significant pressure for many years by an organization that was very determined that I should take my own life. That I have some resonance with that because my determination was that because I have children, I have no right to commit suicide. But my depression was reactive. My upset was a reaction to terrible things happening. Whereas Sylvia Plath, it would appear, had endogenous depression. She was somebody who couldn't get away from feeling bad. It did, if it was a sunny day, it didn't touch her. Somebody brought her tulips and she mistakenly thought that rather than adding oxygen to the room, they were taking it away. And I would say that we should not underestimate the power of the artist, that we live in a time where the arts have moved into this commentary phase that conceptualism, Jeff Koons, Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin, various of these people, Maurizio Catalan, who I tremendously admire, the other three I don't, they are making a commentary on society. They're not making wonderful objects. They are trying to get us to think about sharks and cows and tents and unmade beds and Mickey Mouse and Michael Jackson and a gold toilet called America. They're trying to make us think, which I think is a very noble and wonderful thing to do, but it's not necessarily the task of the visual arts. It may be a task of the visual arts and something, because that's kind of like saying, well, no, just listen to the beautiful language. Don't think about what is being said in the beautiful language. And that to me seems strange. And the idea that you should or must consider some particular piece of art and respect it and have a transcendental experience in front of it seems to me authoritarian.
Well, it's authoritarian. I don't know if it's authoritarian. It's just pointing out, really, that I'm the problem.
Yeah, and we're all the problem, and but Sylvia Plath evidently did have a problem, and she's not on her own. Richard Brautigan, one of my great heroes.
I love Richard Brautigan. I grew up with Richard Brautigan.
He took his life and left behind him a daughter who I think was 14 at the time. If we look back to Virginia Woolf, who Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse.
I've read it.
Yeah. And she basically loaded her pockets with bricks so that she would sink in the water.
Right.
So there is a high propensity. Nick Drake, the great songwriter, killed himself with an overdose of antidepressants. There's something remotely strange about that, somewhat ironic. But to think that these people, if they had this potency of art, I would say if you read Sombrero Fallout or So the Wind Won't Blow It All Away, Brautigan's last two novels, that if you love Richard Brautigan, you cannot help but feel despair. You cannot help but feel dreadful. And I think we each have a right to regulate what we take in emotionally. I've frequently commented about, say, Leonard Cohen, somebody whose beauty of language is inestimable. He is, anyone he can write means nothing to ya with hallelujah has got a real poetic talent, and it was sung, in front of the new president, back tying somebody to a kitchen chair. I don't know what Joe Biden was actually thinking about having this song there, but Obama had "This land is your land, this land is my land" with the three verses about being a socialist sung. So at the same sort of event. But should I be open to all experience? Should another person be able to say, well, look, you've got to see the artistry in the film A Painful Reminder. Look at it from that point of view. The fact that it's about the liberation of Belsen and shows the starved corpses of inmates of that camp, put that aside. That's to sort of, I have to be emotionally autonomous. I have to have control of my emotions. Other people shouldn't be forcing these things into my head. So I have a right at any point in my life to say, no, I don't want that. Other people have a right to say that they think I should have it. And if I've engaged in a communication medium like Twitter, then I deserve whatever I get.
I deserve what I get. I think that's right. So it was a fascinating experience, and I was feeling like I should delete my original tweet. And then I thought, no, this is part of my learning, and I stand by what I said. I didn't mean to ruffle anyone's feathers. That was not intentional. It was my experience. And if people want to push back and say I'm the problem, I don't know, is that part of cancel culture? I never really understood what cancel culture is.
I think it is. I think, and I think to isolate one aspect of a situation and say that alone is the problem, I'm going to push back at that. When I was about 14, my brother Andrew was finishing university, 7 years older than me. And he decided that he would share with me the literature he was reading. So I read The Symposium by Plato. And I benefited tremendously from reading about Socrates and this way of thinking and talking rationally about things rather than passionately, rather than fervently, being able to keep back from the emotional drench of telling other people how awful they were, and instead trying to find out why they thought what they thought and help them to, if I felt, so if I met somebody who was racist, for example, or who had some other irrational construction of thought, how could I help them to think differently rather than how could I, tell them I was right and they were wrong, which, that developed through life. And I found myself talking to fanatics and being able in a single day to talk with somebody with a really fanatical belief. And at the end of the day, them going, I'm not sure it's a good idea to believe that anymore. So that's, that just was a necessity in my life that happened. But also at the age of 14 and 15, he gave me the novel Nausea, which I think was Sartre's first novel, which I found very depressing. It was later to find out that he collaborated with the Nazis, and I'm not in the least surprised. And Simone de Beauvoir did as well. She worked for the Nazi radio station in Paris. So anybody that's into that sort of stuff. He also gave me Metamorphoses and The Trial by Kafka, and I read them and I found them intensely depressing. And at that age, 15 or something, I think it was the wrong thing to do, because you're already more vulnerable to emotions at that age. You have learned infatuation. When you become a teenager, suddenly there's this flourishing of emotions. It's a very difficult time. They aren't the best days of your life. They're probably the most difficult days of your life. It's the time when you're most likely to be recruited into an authoritarian cult. That, and when you get in the sort of age we are now, a few years' time, will be the second most likely age to be recruited into such a group, which we probably won't be, given our past experience. Let's hope. But when somebody is that vulnerable, if we put it another way and you said, if you knew that somebody was suffering from depression and was feeling suicidal, would you then recommend reading Sylvia Plath? So I think there's a balance here of what where the person is and what they need. I think a friend of mine a couple of years ago pointed out, he said, did you read Steppenwolf? And I said, yeah, I did when I was a teenager.
Hermann Hesse.
Yeah, Hermann Hesse. I read a lot of Hermann Hesse. And he said, in Steppenwolf, Hesse says, nobody who is under the age of 50 will understand this book. And he said, so he'd reread it. And he said, it was quite a different book. So I went away and I got a copy of Steppenwolf and I reread it. And he was so right. When I was 18 and read that book, I found it perilously depressing. It was, I didn't need this in my life. When I read it at the age of 60 or whatever it was, it was just wonderful. It was full of light. So I think it does matter how sensitive you are and how good your understanding will be. And that somebody like Sylvia Plath, and that's a wonderful poem, Tulips, but it's also very distressing because it tells you about somebody that you can't reach out to and help. I wrote a novel called Voodoo Child's Slight Return, in which I had Jimi Hendrix as a character who appears in this novel, as he would be in his 60s, as I imagine him. I read a lot about Hendrix. And one of the things that I got to was I constructed his death, that none of the accounts of his death is accurate. There are all sorts of rumors, there's all sorts of nonsense. But there are two sources of information among the biographies, which, if you bring them together, tell you what actually happened on that day. And I can remember writing that piece, that part of the novel, and I'm quite sure I'm correct that most people are wrong about Hendrix's death. He wasn't killed by the FBI or anything like that, but you have to read the book to find out what really happened. But as I found myself writing it, I wanted to reach out and stop it from happening. I wanted to turn him on his side so the vomit wouldn't be aspirated but would go out and he would survive, and we would get more than just that 4 years of this genius. And here I am writing in, nearly 30 years after he died. It's 50 years now. And it evoked such emotion in me, and we have to recognize that in people, that if somebody is emotionally fraught, then it really isn't the right thing to give them Nietzsche or, to throw them down that hole. We need to comfort them and bring them back. So I think we need to have a respect. And I think just by you saying you were 19 years old, that's enough. I'm now thinking about Muddy Waters' song, 19 years old, with ways just like a baby child.
It wasn't enough for this Twitter group.
No. And I understand that there are different perspectives. My perspective is that we should be sensitive to other human beings, and that we shouldn't, for me, the statement you make is interesting. And as I say, I think the person who came back and said, read this beautiful poem, actually answered the question. The problem was not you. The problem was the interface between you and Sylvia Plath, that you didn't at that point have a tutor on the course who said, well, look at this. But I would still probably think that at 19, and if you were feeling emotionally sensitive, it was bad medicine. It was not the right time. As with Steppenwolf, come back to it later.
Come back to it later. Absolutely. And I'm in hindsight, I'm glad that I had the wherewithal to self-regulate. I was not, nor am I, suicidal or into self-harm or any of that. It just doesn't show up with me. But I was and am a sensitive person, and so it was also a time when I joined and helped found a cult. I was at the ground floor.
Yeah.
I'm good at it. In case you want to start one, I can help you.
That's good.
Call this 800 number, toll free.
Yeah.
Cults are us.
Start a cult.
But at that time, I was living in a house with someone who would rise, if you will, to power, and three women. And so I was in a circle there whilst going to UC San Diego studying literature and computer science. So I was in a very stressful situation. And I guess I sensed that I didn't need the additional burden of this woman who dearly, dearly wanted to commit suicide.
Yeah.
But hadn't quite gotten to it. But was, it seemed clear to me that that was the journey that she was on. It kind of reminds me of, jump ahead some number of years, when I was in graduate school. I got a scholarship to an MFA, Master in Fine Arts, creative nonfiction program at University of Pittsburgh, the oldest writing program in the United States. And
still taught by Herman Melville to this day. Sorry.
And it's a whale of a course.
It's a whale of a course.
Well. So I ended up dropping out after 2 weeks of that program because of a philosophy that is known as deconstructionism, or a type of postmodernism.
Yes.
And it's not the same thing, but there are some parallels in that. I, as a 19-year-old, didn't want to go into the journey where, well, you could commit suicide or you don't, or you do. It's just like a rabbit hole. It's a whole world where you make these choices and you see an oven or you see a knife and like, should I, or should, I just didn't want to play in these trade-offs. It's like, I don't want to fight that fight or study deeply about the forces that someone else's, the winds that were buffeting somebody who was going through that journey or that challenge, if you will, or that path, the path of Sylvia Plath. Jumping ahead to the postmodernism, I left not because there's no merit whatsoever to postmodernism, deconstructionism from Foucault or Derrida or any of these people, but rather because I didn't want to go down that rabbit hole. I thought it was a huge freaking, for me, waste of time. And so I left, and I said, like, I believe that words have meaning, and I'm going to use words and I wrote my first book, Take Me for a Ride, Coming of Age in a Destructive Cult. I used words kind of like a journalist, but also it was an autobiography. It's like, this is my story of how I got in and out of the inner circle of a destructive cult. I don't want to use words that, I don't want to think that words are so meaningless that I could just say, fla, blah, rickledy-da, schmendrick's foot, nose, hair, cheese with bristles at the edge of them. I'm just making up shit here.
Well, I mean, you've actually gone back in time to the 1920s and the surrealist poets at this point, because that's exactly what they did.
Well, yes, and we could all drop some LDS and see where that takes us.
And how many people are reading Soupault and Breton now? Not many, probably. Fish, bananas, cheese, frog, beef, and trout.
And trout fishing in America, going back to Richard Brautigan. Yeah. But I just didn't want to spend 2 years in graduate school or gradual school, because it was actually quite gradual, and have these massive discussions and pay all this money. And actually it was a scholarship, but I just didn't want to take that part of my life and say, do words have meaning? No, they don't. Yes, they do. And go into all this. It seemed like quicksand. And it seemed like I did some research, and the people who were in this program all got depressed, like severely depressed. They stopped writing as artists, and I said goodbye. And I had a full scholarship, a teaching scholarship, that is, but I didn't have to pay tuition. It's actually a fairly pricey school. And I said, adieu,
Hasta la vista, baby.
Baby. And the guy who brought this philosophy over to the United States, into Yale, from which, from where it emanated to all the universities, was a Nazi empathizer, because, words have no meaning. So what a great way to hide your Nazi past. And when it was discovered that this man was a Nazi empathizer, he said, and the media started writing about it, he said, no, words have no meaning.
Yeah, let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Thank you for that.
Somebody 40 years ago said to me that there are only 5 ways of looking at the world, and any human being will fit into one of those 5 ways, and they will be insistent about it. And that is the way of Plato, the way of Aristotle, the way of the Cynics, the Stoics, or the Epicureans. And you can mix them about and you can get where you go. Now, I am an Epicurean Stoic, which is to say that rather than the miserable Marcus Aurelius, I'm more to Epictetus. I don't know much about this, but I'm good at dropping names. And I am absolutely devoted to the work of Jiang Tzu, the great Chinese sage, who pretty much said, I don't know what's going on. I haven't got a clue. Don't know where it came from. Don't know where I'm going. Not going to get upset about it. I think I'm going fishing. Yeah, let's go fishing. So where the great teacher Lao Tzu, and I've translated Lao Tzu, so I've spent a lot of time fishing in those waters. Lao Tzu said, you should embrace the Tao, the underlying force that is in the universe. You should embrace this. Don't fight against it. Go with it. Embrace it. And then you should teach it to the princes. Jiang Tzu, who we now think may have actually been a contemporary of Lao Tzu rather than following him later on, we don't know. But Jiang Tzu said, embrace the Tao and then go fishing. Now, I've spent my life trying to embrace the Tao and share it with the princes, help people to change things. And it's not really had that much of an effect, I don't think, certainly on the princes. And I'm wondering now at the age of 65, should I learn how to use a fishing pole? Is that where I've been going wrong all of these years? Now, if we take this...
You tried trout fishing in America.
Well, not in America, but I could try it locally. With the COVID-19, America's become impossible. But
actually, it was impossible before COVID-19.
Yeah, trout fishing, it's not what it used to be, frankly.
No, I'm saying America.
America's not what it used to be, and trout fishing in America is not what it used to be, therefore.
I think the whole thing of what's happening in America is a bit fishy.
I think it certainly is.
Yeah.
And so I would say this, firstly, the temperament that you come to the world with. And I'm a huge supporter of Eric Fromm, as everybody knows. And Fromm said, you're born with the temperament and you develop character. And there's this pretend word personality that is what these things make. And we really do get into language at this point. And what on earth do we mean by these things? So you're born with the temperament. That is to say, let's face it, you're anxious, you're happy, you're sad, there are, you're sanguine, you have one of the 4 humors. There is a way that you will be born into the world and approach the world. Then what will happen to you is that you will develop character. And I think if you make certain fundamental decisions, and mine as a teenager was that I would like to be happy. I also wanted to know the truth. I didn't want to be happy because I was deceiving myself. I realized that there was a lot of that going on. And I ended up joining a dreadful cult group because I wanted to know the truth, but I also wanted to be happy. And so to me, those two things fit together. I have a great book by the philosopher Schopenhauer, who wrote a lot of stuff that I haven't read, in which he worked out basically that life is miserable and you just have to get on with it. Then he wrote a little book about happiness, in which he says, I've proved that life is miserable. Here's how to make the best of it. And his answer is the life of the mind, that no matter what's going on outside, as long as you are thinking, as long as you are reading your Sylvia Plath and going ahead, then things are fine. On that point, I would say that we have, and you really have, stimulated a lot of thought here. We have associated and disassociated responses. Now, when it comes to memory, for example, an associated memory means that when you remember it, you will feel, so post-traumatic stress disorder has associated memories. So you feel the same trauma over and over again. Dissociated memory, and we usually use the term dissociation to mean something negative. Dissociated memory means that you can look at it without feeling. And I would say that if somebody's come to that point in poesy where they are, they read Philip Larkin, he's a great example of it, or the poem Or Bard by Philip Larkin, where he says every morning he wakes before the light comes and watches the light creep behind the blinds and realizes that he's going to die. And that's just not my way of being. But I realized that I'm sensitive enough that if all the people around me were, for example, of the conviction that to keep the sun in the sky, you have to rip people's hearts out and offer them fresh, otherwise the sun won't rise, that it might be a bit of a risk to go for a day without ripping a heart out. Now, I can see the social proof, the idea of I might fall into that. If I'd gone and worked for Ron Hubbard, I could well have become a zealot. I could well have become a weaponized empath. So to dismiss the individual's feelings, which is the first thing that's being dismissed, that you have a right to say, I didn't feel like doing that. I didn't want to eat Thai food that evening. And somebody else has a right to say, well, you should eat Thai food. Thai food's good for you, and it is. It's lovely stuff. Unless you've got a peanut allergy, this.
Right. Don't diss Thai food.
No, I would never. I love Thai food.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like Sylvia Plath.
But I have a friend who has a peanut allergy, and it would kill him. And so part of it is, if you are somebody who is prone to associating things, I came to love poetry by reading Wilfred Owen, the First World War poet. That was the guy who first got me, this idea of these horrific scenes that he was portraying. And when I was 13 or 14, I could deal with that. That didn't bother me. But I have every sympathy for somebody who says, they don't want to look at the paintings of Francis Bacon, for example, the screaming popes or that kind of stuff. When I visited the Tate Gallery and saw those many years ago, 50 years ago, I had to get out of the room because it made me want to throw up. It's the only time that's ever happened to me in front of visual art.
It's very, very powerful. So a quick two responses, one or two and a half. One is that in terms of getting out of that room, getting out of that gallery, and this ties back to something you said. When I dropped that class at UC San Diego, UCSD, I took another class in its stead. And do you know what I studied in its stead?
I don't, oddly enough.
Well, I think you actually do, because you mentioned it. I studied Lao Tzu.
Yeah.
The way of Lao Tzu. It was a course. It was with a wonderful. I took 2 courses with him. Wonderful Chinese lit, and it was just UCSD English department. It's just lit department is just fabulous. And so I studied, the way and go fishing, and that fit very well, very, 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 very well for me. The other response I wanted to share with you is you're talking about a book you wrote. So I have just started writing. I'm actually writing 2 books right now. One is nonfiction about my adventures in the United States government, sort of like a modern day Confederacy of dunces, and insider kind of story. And the second book is a dystopian novel.
Okay.
And I'm just starting to frame the story and set up who's the narrator. And I'm just at the so that'd be my third, my fourth, and my fifth book. And I'm just getting a feel internally. This is all happening inside me before I start writing anything down.
Oh yeah.
And I'm just starting to write things down now. And I'm coming up with possible names of the characters and what their sex is or what their sex isn't. And what everything. I mean, there's so many dimensions before you even get, the first sentence set. For me, I remember one of my books took 6 months before I got one sentence out.
I spent a year writing the first page of Voodoo Child Slight Return, and until I had the first page, I couldn't write the rest.
Couldn't go any further. Exactly. So is it all has to align and internally, and so I just thought I'd share. I guess this conversation was sparked by this tweet I sent last night. Also last night, I was working on this book, which is current working title is Certs, CERTS, which stands for a kind of person who's certain.
Okay.
There's the certs and the chaots. So, and I just titled the book this morning. It's like,
excellent. Yeah, I love that.
It's going to be called Certs. And I guess my point is, I had these incredible dreams last night where I was the character that I was just starting to craft inside this novel. But in the dream, I mean, it was a dream. It wasn't physical. It wasn't in the physical world, but in the context of the dream, it all seemed rather real. And so I was on this incredible journey of, it starts with an escape because the cert suddenly wasn't so certain. And they did that. And so there was this whole, it's a bit like, I don't know, you call it 1984-esque or Orwellian. Is that the right term? I have a huge amount of respect for Mr. Orwell.
Up to his last days when things went a bit wrong, but
tell me about it.
Well, 1984 is not finished. He was so ill that he couldn't edit it.
Oh, I see.
And
right.
So
right.
That's the first part of it. There are 2 parts to it. I'm a huge, again, in my teens, I read a lot of Orwell, and say Coming Up for Air, I think is a perfect novel. Keep the Aspidistra Flying, The Clergyman's Daughter, so on and so forth. I just loved, and he had a simple and straightforward way of writing, much like, say, Hemingway.
Yeah.
And pontificated about that, and I do disagree with some of his points there. So, for example, he said you should always use the shortest word in politics in the English language, and because that's the word people will understand. So I would venture that most people would understand the word particle better than they would the word iota or mote, M-O-T-E. So I think that's a false principle. Okay. You use if you want to write journalistic English, you use the most commonly used word. If you want to write poetic English, you don't. So, but tremendous respect. 1984 is not finished. It doesn't have the polish that his other novels have. It is slow. It is laborious. I've read it twice. The appendix to it is the greatest thing he ever wrote, I think, where he talks about language and how you can mess with people's minds if they can't think in the words. So the words do become important. What's more troubling is that he was informing on his fellow members of socialist groups to the intelligence services at the end of his life. So he was actually doing, yeah, but he was betraying his friends. And I don't think there's any evidence that he betrayed anybody who was actually dangerous. It was the "are you now or have you ever been?" He was just naming people who could then be, treated in this way. So that's rather difficult. But Animal Farm and Homage to Catatonia, as I like to think of it.
Catalonia, yeah.
No, Catatonia. That's as I like to think of it. Homage to Catatonia, which is that we all should lie very still for a period of time every day.
In a catatonic state.
Down and Out in Paris and London, that, and I read 5 volumes of his essays. I saturated myself in my teens and early 20s with Orwell, while still being a member of a cult group. Bear this in mind, that I didn't. It was Aldous Huxley that actually woke me up to what Scientology was doing, because, it's not a Stalinist cult as 1984 is. It's a, hey, we're all having a great time sort of cult, which is, I think, more invidious.
Take a few chemicals here and there.
More we are. Have you read Ira Levin's This Perfect Day? Because in terms of dystopian novels, Spike pointed it out to me a couple of years ago. That is an astonishing. He wrote The Stepford Wives as well.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, and a few other movies, I think. But that is a remarkable, straightforward dystopian novel, which I think has more power than Brave New World, because he does actually communicate in a way that we can all get hold of. But so yes, we are wandering around today. What an excellent thing this is to peripatetic thinking. I also bring up the notion of whether language can actually say anything. The Wittgenstein, I'm told, talked about language games and said that the problem ultimately with all philosophy is that it will be a language game. And I think that's a very useful thing, because philosophers, I remember years ago tuning into a radio program where 4 philosophers were going to have a discussion about something. And the first one said, I think we should first determine whether we're here or not. And they spent the whole program doing that. So,
oh my God, that's the funniest thing I've heard in about a week and a third.
A week and a third. And I strongly believe that art and experience exists at the interface between us and the world. Therefore, when James Joyce said, you will interpret my work in your way, and it's not necessarily what I meant. And that's fine. I think that's a useful kind of way of dealing with the world. And it does then reassert that right for a 19-year-old to say, it's not time. This fruit is not ripe. I'll come back later, or I won't. And
also, I did. I came back. Came back this morning.
Yeah, and we found a beautiful poem that really does say, if I was 19 and feeling a little fragile, this would not be useful to me. This, it doesn't matter how beautiful the language is. I'd be better off reading, Gerard Manley Hopkins or Tennyson.
Or Lao Tzu.
I'd certainly be better off reading Lao Tzu. I mean, I read Lao Tzu when I was 17, and I've never re-emerged. It was so important to me, and it kept me safe all the way through my culty experience, so that I was able, after 9 years in Scientology, to stand up to it. Whereas most people have been so abused and humiliated and torn down that they can't. And the reason I could stand up to it was I'd always stood up to it. Whenever there was anything that I thought was wrong, I'd questioned it. And I believe that a lot of that came from this Lao Tzu and this very straightforward approach to the world, that we're not going to deal with gods and beasties and, things that go bump in the night and the invisible hand of capitalism. We're not going to deal with those abstractions. We're going to deal with what's actually happening. And I think Lao Tzu was helpful to me in that.
I think he was helpful to me as well. So just to kind of paraphrase that in a slight way, to see if you agree with this. In a sense, would you agree that Lao Tzu, it wasn't quite hierarchical in the way that others would? It was sort of like, just come down to earth. This is a rock.
Yeah.
Look at the rock. And of course, that takes us back to Aldous Huxley with Doors of Perception, where this is a chair, just stare at the chair for 4 hours.
It's a beautiful indigo because I've taken mescaline.
Because I've taken more than my fair share of mescaline, actually.
I think he probably did, yeah.
but there was something, of course, Lao Tzu didn't need the mescaline.
No.
And which actually reminds me of a book called The Snow Leopard by Peter Matheson. Are you familiar with that?
I haven't read it. I've heard of it. Yeah, I should read it.
One of my favorite books. He actually, I wrote to Matheson about the cult leader I was involved with. He said this, he doesn't your teacher doesn't understand what Zen is about. And I think Matheson was quite correct. But Matheson, The Snow Leopard is about this journey that he took with a naturalist out to the Himalaya. And
how pleasant to see it called the Himalaya instead of the Himalayas.
Indeed.
Even my Indian daughter-in-law calls it the Himalayas. I mean, what can we say?
Oh, I'm so sorry for that. Those towering peaks, which I can't wait to get back to. I'm there in my thoughts and in my heart. So Matheson's hiking there. He's having these thoughts and he's thinking about experiences he's had. It's sort of like the hiking in the mountains, looking for this legendary snow leopard is sort of the backdrop for him to explore. And one of the things he's talking about is drugs. And going back to Mr. Huxley and mescaline.
And the LSD. Huxley's last words were LSD, try some, by the way.
Fascinating.
He took LSD on the day he died.
Fascinating. As opposed to Jimi Hendrix, who took twice as much LSD on the day he died.
Well,
you have to read a novel to know about that.
Died from a barbiturate.
Oh, did he?
Overdose, and he was given. I've told you, I know about this. He was given 8 pills by this woman who knew they would kill him.
Oh.
She was told by her doctor, and this is an arcane piece of information, never take more than 2. Because they were German barbiturates, he probably mistook them for another drug.
Which Keith Moon, I think, made some little boo-boo. But the cult leader I studied with, he took like 250 phenobarbital, so I don't think there was a mistake there. And then went for a swim in the Long Island Sound. But getting back to Peter Matheson, John, he was saying, you can come up to a lake, and the lake is deep. And on the bottom of the lake is wisdom. And there's different ways to get to the wisdom. He said, you can show up here and you could bring like 590 cases, I'm paraphrasing, of TNT, dynamite.
I think it was 573 in the original.
Yeah, it was 573, yeah, with 2 more sticks on the side. And you could light them. And everything blows up, and then you could walk down because there's no water anymore. You could walk down, and you're in the wisdom. You're at the bottom of the where the lake had been, and that works. And that's taking the power drugs. There's only one problem, he pointed out, and he certainly understood this from his life experiences, and that is this collateral damage, as there would be with dynamite. To your psyche with the power drugs. He said there's another way to do it. And this reminds me of our brief discussion about Lao Tzu, the course I took after dropping the class about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. And that is, you show up each morning, possibly early in the morning, with a little pail, like a little small wooden pail with a little handle. And you look all around you and you bend down and you scoop up a little bit of the water from the lake and you walk away. And the next day you do the same thing. And then the day after that, you do the same thing, and so on. And eventually you'll get down to the wisdom.
So it may take as long as teaching a stone to talk, as Annie Dillard points out,
as only Annie Dillard would know.
Yeah,
And
the great Annie Dillard. Yeah.
Talk about the teaching a stone to talk, or leaving no stone unturned, or no turn unstoned, as Ken Kesey.
Everybody must get stoned. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So I always held that as I watched my friends and people I knew take a lot of drugs growing up in the 70s and 80s. And I thought two different ways to get there.
Well, and then there's Lao Tzu's way to get there, which is to be quiet until the water settles, until the mud has settled and you can see through the water, as the sages of old did, as he says. And that's the approach where you do nothing and everything will be done, which is essential to his hypothesis, that it is a matter of slowing yourself down. It is a matter of actually arriving and overcoming that ambition to have wisdom, because you want wisdom for the wrong reasons, which could lead us to Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras, where he too talks about achieving magical powers through 5 routes, one of which is powerful drugs, one of which is magic. Then he says in the end, the only real way is through wisdom, through understanding, because otherwise you won't understand the collateral damage. You won't understand what harm you're doing.
That's absolutely fascinating. And then, of course, Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, would have said, everyone's got their own approach, right? We don't want to leave anybody out. She would have said, just say no to rugs.
Well, and of course, what she did say, and the end bit's always clipped off, is say no to drugs and alcohol. That's what she said. And alcohol's been cut off. And when you look at her when she's making the announcement, she is so stoned out of her gourd because she was on 6 prescription medicines. Just say no to drugs and alcohol. My husband
was it drugs? I thought she said say no to rugs.
No, you see, that could be where you've been going wrong all of this time.
Oh my gosh. You're saying it was drugs with a D.
Yeah, and you've probably been cutting a rug instead of cutting a caper.
I thought the whole thing was the rug is that platform on which we all stand. But no, it's drugs. Just say no to all these years. I've been saying no to rugs.
And it should be say no, thank you. There should be some etiquette involved here.
Well, thank you very much. It's the nicest thing that anyone's ever done for me.
My pleasure. I think we've probably, along a commodious vicus, as James Joyce put it, and I don't know what that means, we've arrived at a symmetrical point where...
and we've even discussed Wales.
Yeah, Wales, land of the mist and the rain.
A bit to the west, isn't it?
They reckon they've actually discovered a new species of whale, a new type of baleen whale that it hadn't noticed before.
Oh, I was talking about Wales, England.
Well, Wales next to England. Let's be
next to England. Yes.
Not get into any trouble.
Be careful there, Mr. Laxer.
It'll be like the Marcher Lords in the 12th century and how they did over the Welsh.
Oh my gosh.
Pryderi and the Mabinogion and all of that great stuff.
Yes. A new species of whales, yes.
New species of whale, a baleen whale of some kind, that they'd mistakenly identified as some other species. I mean, when it comes to species, my favorite story is of a biologist who was on holiday in Vietnam, and he was offered a rat on a stick to eat. Very tasty rat.
As one does, yeah.
Yeah, and he looked at it and he went, I don't know what species this is. I don't know what this is. And he went and he discovered that it wasn't, it hadn't been given a Linnaean classification. So he was at a restaurant and discovered an endangered species that he was eating at the time.
I think I read about that. Was that rat on stickus?
Yes, Ratus sticky tartus.
Stickus tartar.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, it's
satay rat.
Every man to his rat on stick, I guess.
Yeah. So these are great days. So you know, we've read a Sylvia Plath poem. We've talked about Chinese philosophy. We mentioned Wittgenstein, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. None of whom Richard the Great, Richard Brautigan. Rush out and buy Revenge of the Lawn, anybody who's watching, because it is the most remarkable collection of hilarious and surreal stories I've ever read. Tokyo Montana Express is very good too. But I think by then he was getting a bit too sad. I years ago, 1988, I was in Montreal and I spent 3 days with Suzanne Verdal, who is known to the world through the song Suzanne, about written by Leonard Cohen. She is that Suzanne, and she was very much as described in that amazing song. She was remarkable.
Did she take you down to a river? Did you
tea, oranges, all that kind of stuff? And then Jesus was being a
sailor who
walking upon the water, and spent a long time watching from a lonely wooden tower. But when he knew for certain only drowning men would see him, he said, all men are sailors until the sea shall free them. But she told me, when I mentioned Richard Brautigan, that she'd stayed in his apartment, you know? So it's like, there's 6 degrees of separation. No, there's only 1 degree of separation between you and everyone, you know?
So I used to live in Montreal, and I used to live 3 blocks from Leonard Cohen.
Yeah. Isn't it a beautiful, the old town, isn't it beautiful?
It's just fabulous.
Yeah. Well, and so there we are. We end in a as we began, in a Russian restaurant in Montreal.
A little bucket, and
yes, another little bucket full, and then it rains.
Hey, excuse me, I have to go get my dynamite. But always a pleasure, John. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. So I'm John Atack. This is my great good friend Mark Laxer, and we hope that we have intrigued you rather than and amazed you rather than bored the hell out of you with our ramblings.
Right, and do not follow at Mark Laxer, because you don't know what's going to happen.
Don't try this at home. And what's the other ones? I got out. Yes,
that's a hashtag. That's # I got out.
Yeah, it's what you call a pound sign, but for us it's a number sign, because our pound signs are kind of out.
Yes, or you could call it a quid sign.
A quid sign, quid pro quo.
Well, or you could play Quidditch.
Quidditch, yes, we could, but we're not going to. So
you could play Quidditch. Yes, you could.
We could indeed, and we could play quoits, you know, if we had to. But and a quotidian basis as well, you know.
I think it's time to quit.
I think it probably is. Thanks so much. We'll switch off the record buttons.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
Fla, blah, rickledy-da, schmendrick's foot, nose, hair, cheese.